Today I'll talk about biodiversity, which I think is and one of the ESG factors that perhaps hasn't necessarily been given the attention that it really deserves. And I'll tell you why, and I'll tell how that might be changing very quickly and how it could be particularly relevant to your organizations and potentially even to your roles. So allow me to share my slides. I'll start with just a very brief kind of introduction to who I am, and then we can get started. I would certainly welcome this to be the most interactive possible. So we'll certainly leave time for questions at the end. But if you have any questions, be it clarifying, be it comments, etc., in the middle of the presentation, please don't hesitate to just go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask me. So what I'm going to propose to you here is, and perhaps by the end of our conversation today, I will have convinced you, is that biodiversity really is the new client, the new climate, and the new client as well, it might be, but certainly the new climate, both with regards to upcoming regulation, with regards to risks to your loan portfolios, with regards to risk to your, for example, SME clients. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Clarisse Simonek. I've been working in this space for over 15 years, mostly in the investment side. The image that you see here, you might recognize it. It's the University of Cambridge. The only time that I've stepped away from the industry was to lead Cambridge's sustainable Center for Sustainable Finance, specifically its investment leaders group that was already almost 10 years ago now, 7 years ago now, already developing frameworks to how do you quantify climate risk at a company level, at a sector level, how do you stress test your portfolio for it, and how do you report on the impact of your mainstream investments against environmental and social factors. Today, I wear quite a few hats. I'm an advisor to the UK government on green finance. I'm a member to Standard & Poor's Global Rating Scientific Council for Sustainable Finance. And I'm also academic advisor for the CFA on their ESG investing certification. And I still am very much involved in the industry, continuing to support banks and investors on setting up their ESG strategies and building capacity via my own company these days. So why biodiversity? Why are we talking about biodiversity? Because the reality of ESG has been, and perhaps unfortunately, is that most of the ESG factors have been kind of taken out of the spotlight because of climate, right? And there's really good reason for that, and I'll come to that later. But I think with COVID, we've seen the reality that it does go beyond climate, right? And we've really identified both at a government level, at corporate level, at investor level, and at bank level, the importance of the social, right? So it really has risen in terms of attention in the agenda that boards and that financial organizations have to that in terms of the impact of their financial and capital allocation, but also in terms of the risks that they can be taking on. And biodiversity was also teased out quite a bit around COVID, right? You might have heard the theories, the sciences of, it's because we are invading the space of animals that we are in greater interaction with diseases that perhaps before, wouldn't be so easily in touch with us and accessible to us. But there's a much wider reason why increasingly governments, regulators, and the private sector as well is looking at biodiversity. So before I answer that question of why, let me just remind you of what are the economic interdependencies, right, between finance, investment, capital, and society and environment. So you might remember the definition of sustainable development, right, which are three circles: social, social, environmental, and economic, and sustainable development in the middle. And I think it's a bit of a pity that that's how our understanding of sustainable development started, because at the end of the day, it's not about finding where the three meet. It's actually recognizing the interdependency that our economy has, that the return of your loan portfolio has, that the ability of your company to pay back its loans, et cetera, is actually interdependent on society, interdependent on the environment, right? And here, it's actually a report that I contributed to Cambridge CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where we identified some of these key interdependencies, right? So the dependency of labor, for example, of skilled labor towards the economy, towards economic activity, the fact that there's private wealth that leaves that, for example, in the sense of taxes impacting and ideally contributing to society, and the interdependencies on economies as well, right? We have ecosystems that are contributing to the possibility of certain economic activities. And on the other hand, for example, the output of waste and emissions that can have a negative impact on the environment. So really recognizing that this cycle can be virtuous or can be a vicious cycle, right? And that's our choice in how we contribute to the stability of the financial system by paying attention to the impact that we have, that our organizations have, that our financial products have on society and the environment. So why does it matter? Perhaps some of you have seen this diagram. It's from the Stockholm Resilience Center, which has identified that our planet has planetary boundaries. What does it mean? It means that if we are beyond certain planetary boundaries, we can actually take the state of our planet to a new state, right? So you can actually think about it. For example, if you understand a little bit of the ice age and the climate that we've had previous to the climate being stable as we see today, we had significant variations of climate, which actually took the planet to very different states of being, right? And it was really in the Holocene era that because of the stabilization of climate within within +1 and -1, that we were able to have a stable society. And that's when agriculture came in, and that's where the society that we know today was really able to be established. So what they recognize is that there are 9 planetary boundaries, but 2 boundaries are actually core. It means that breaching them could take us to a state that we don't really know what that means. And those 2 core these 2 core boundaries identified by scientists is biodiversity and climate. So why are we talking a lot about climate? Because it's the easiest of those planetary boundaries, to be very honest with you, right? It's easier for us to see the impact of it. It's easier for us to quantify it to a certain extent. Obviously, there are challenges in doing the numbers, but it's plus carbon equivalents or minus carbon equivalents. And biodiversity is so much more complex than that. What you see on the top over there is a little QR code, hopefully not now, so that you are able to listen to the rest of the presentation and engage with it. But if you wish, after the presentation, you can just use your phone to tap it, and it'll take it to in YouTube to how do you call it? The preview of a documentary called Breaking Boundaries, which was led by David Attenborough, which actually explains these concepts in a very friendly way. My child has watched it and quite enjoyed it. So it really explains, what are these planetary boundaries? Why are they meaningful? Where are we with them, right? And one of the things that I think we need to be very conscious of is that we have the power to impact this. If you think of the right over there, where we see ozone depletion, you might remember that back in the 80s, that was actually in red. All of the governments were particularly concerned that our ozone layer was being depleted by chemicals that we use. And we've been able to, as a society, bring it back to a safe level. So the way that we allocate capital actually has an impact on the stability of our planet and the stability of our financial system. So let's go on to biodiversity. What does biodiversity mean, right? It's not that simple. It's quite complex. When I started studying it, it was certainly not as simple as climate, as I mentioned. So biodiversity is actually broken down into three different things. So one is genetic diversity. There are different types of dogs, there are different races of dogs, there are different types of bananas, etc. Different species. So there are dogs, there are cats, there are bananas, there are apples. And there's ecological diversity, which is actually just as important, right? You have mangroves, you have tropical forests, and all of these are particularly important because they actually contribute to the functioning of our planet, right? You might have heard the comments that were the rainforest in Brazil to be significantly deforested and become the desert, which actually is what happened to the Sahara. It actually has the impact to change the currents of the oceans. That's how impactful ecological diversity is, right? We actually have the power to change how the planet actually functions. So where are we with regards to biodiversity? And unfortunately, the story is, as you might imagine, quite challenging. So 25% of our plants and animal species are threatened by human action. It's millions of species facing extinctions, and many within just a few decades. So that is the state that we are in terms of the production systems that we have, the consumption systems that we have, etc. And if you don't care so much about animals and plants, why should you care as a financial institution? It's because 44 trillion of economic value generation is dependent on nature. And that was the statistics that was calculated by economists and scientists of the World Economic Forum. And there has been studies by, for example, the French central bank, the Banque de France, by the Dutch central bank, whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, all demonstrating that nearly 30% of their financial institutions are dependent on biodiversity. So this has been catching up in terms of regulators starting to look at it. You might remember Mark Carney, when he was chair of the Financial Stability Board, 2015, really stepping up and saying climate is a systemic risk to the financial system. We need to take a look at this. Central banks need to be aware of this, need to start mitigating the risk and engaging their financial institutions to identify the risk that they're carrying. And now, we're increasingly talking about stress tests, etc. So something similar is starting to happen with regards to biodiversity. And the Banque de France actually called the report that they recently launched on the risk of biodiversity to their economic system as a silent spring, right? So it is something that's creeping up without it being necessarily very evident to all of those actors in the private sector. So what you see here is the G20 leaders last year, in a very important meeting that they had, they actually recognized that the TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, should be made mandatory. Up to now, it was only a voluntary initiative. And interestingly enough, they recognized the importance of the sister initiative, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, nature here being basically a synonym for biodiversity. And it's going to start being a recommendation, but you can see where the train is heading, right? So what they say here, and I'll just read it out. We're also looking forward to the establishment of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and its recommendations. The TCFD and the TNFD will help mobilize the trillions of dollars of private sector finance needed and reinforce government policy for us to meet net zero commitments. And they're not talking just about climate here. They're talking really about net zero in the sense of the stability of our planet and the sort of financial system. And we're not talking here about NGOs, right? We're talking here about the leaders, the central banks of G20 and the G7, but the G20 as well has recently recognized it. So we see it from this very tight circle of only developed countries increasingly others jumping on the bandwagon to recognize this. So let me perhaps just pause. That was quite a bit of a download. So before we go down the rabbit hole a little bit, let me just pause and see if there are any questions.
Don't hesitate to use the chat also while Clarisse is talking. You can also drop your questions on the chat, and then we can look at that and share them with the group and with Clarisse.
No questions? All particularly evident? Excellent. All right, so what's the timeline? Perhaps a little bit sooner than what one would expect. So already in 2020 and 21, there was quite a lot of support of this. As I mentioned, Banque de France, the Dutch, and the UK as well, engaging on this theme. You might have heard in the UK that the Dasgupta report, which wasn't necessarily a review of the central bank of the risk of the financial system, but it was the bank commissioning a report to identify what was the risk of what's the risk to the UK of biodiversity loss. And we see there that the next step to that was building out the framework for the TNFD, so setting up this task force, conducting consultations, and now we already have a beta framework that is being tested by some leading corporates and leading financial institutions. And what we see here is that in 2023, we already expect that to be ready for uptake by the private sector. And here I just mentioned, so I think perhaps it's a bit repetitive, that this has been given the green light in terms of its relevance for the financial sector by the G7. So again, you have the QR code over there on the top in case you want to explore this a bit further. But this over here is basically a brief description of what the beta framework looks like. So basically it talks about things that you would expect, right? What's the business footprint? Where do you have the operations? And we have to think about supply chains as well. One of the reasons why I think that biodiversity will catch us by surprise is because it took us such a long time to understand how to incorporate climate in input-output models, into understanding supply chains and the risks, etc. But we've done all that work with climate, right? So now integrating biodiversity into that framework, into these processes, is going to be a lot faster because we have spent already 10 years setting these processes up, at least for carbon. So it'll go into evaluation, especially of the dependency. So we're looking at impact and dependency. Then eventually you'll have to assess the material risk and opportunity should there be, and set targets, reports, etc., etc. So all of the process that we've been seeing with climate, we're going to start seeing exactly the same thing with regards to biodiversity. And reporting, there are already some 2 or 3 key indicators that are being used by financial institutions to assess their exposure in an aggregate level to biodiversity, both in terms of the impact of their portfolios, the impact of their loan portfolios, but also in terms of their exposure to biodiversity loss and its risk. So what about regulators? Some of you who perhaps might be familiar to the French system a bit more, you might know that there was an Article 173, which was quite pioneering back in 2016 in requiring all its financial institutions, especially financial products, to report on their impact on climate and also on the risk of climate change, right? So for example, every fund in France above, it's 500 million. Is that correct? I might be mistaken, but above a certain threshold of AUM needs to report on this annually, right? How do you mitigate, how do you identify the risk, how do you manage, how do you mitigate it, etc. So now they've just upgraded this article, this regulatory requirement. It's now called Article 29, and it's basically 173 on steroids. So it takes climate to a whole different level in terms of the level of precision that you need to have in terms of the methodologies that you calculate, the integration of climate in mainstream core risk processes. But what it does as well is it adds biodiversity to the mix, right? So there you have already the first government in the world that is requiring financial institutions, all of them, not only ESG products, all of them, to report on biodiversity. And what we've seen is that there was a lot of learning of the EU and eventually other jurisdictions as well of Article 173, right? Because there was basically the testing ground of what works, what can we demand, and it sets up a minimum standard. So we can assume that Article 29 will effectively do the same for biodiversity, that the TNFD will have strong communication with that and be able to roll out to the G7, eventually to G20 and other countries, the risk and the impact that companies should report with regards to biodiversity. And here on the right, again, the little QR code that you can read the report that the Bank of France issued on this. So what are some of the resources that you as a financial institution has? I'm not going to go through all of them, don't worry, but here you have a list. You'll be receiving these slides after the presentation, so you can explore them a little bit, but I'll go through one or two, don't remember now, but certainly one of them, which I think is quite advanced. And you will hear in the next slides a presentation from CEOs of large financial institutions, why they care about biodiversity and what they're doing, and what, most importantly, what's their commitment to it.
We call on the global leaders
to agree on effective measures
to reverse nature loss in this decade.
Biodiversity loss is a major issue for our planet and our societies. The disruption of ecosystems can result in critical problems.
If production methods and diets do not change, humanity could face catastrophic environmental, political, and social consequences.
We are totally convinced that biodiversity is an absolute necessity if we want to continue to develop our civilization.
We therefore commit to the problem.
By 2024, at the latest.
Collaborating and sharing knowledge.
Engage with companies.
Assess impact.
Set targets.
and report publicly.
Let's see. Let me continue sharing now. But the reason why I shared this video with you, because I thought it was quite impactful. You're not seeing here NGOs or the fund of the UN or small pension funds for certain sectors that are particularly sensitive, right? We are really seeing here AXA, HSBC, large financial institutions that are saying, first of all, governments, you need to do something, which is to set an equivalent to a Paris Agreement, right? We financial institutions are not made to decide what is applicable in terms of reductions of biodiversity loss, etc. So governments, you need to act. And then industry, we need to act together, right? We need to share information. We need to collaborate on engaging with companies, right? And then obviously, last but not least, is they are committed to themselves setting targets. I mean, this doesn't, if you're not aware so much of biodiversity, seems impressive that in 2 years' time, these companies are setting targets of reduction. We don't even know how to start doing this, right? We just started doing it a year ago, right? For all disclosure, I used to work for OCM, which is one of the CEOs that you see in this video. we had absolutely no idea what we were doing about a year and a half ago, right? So there's a lot to go in terms of from doing something on one fund, which we did. We established a fund that reduces impact on biodiversity by 80%, to actually being able to roll that out to a whole organization, to across all of the funds, ESG and non-ESG funds, right? So it's quite ambitious. So what do these organizations commit to doing, right? It's collaboration and knowledge sharing. And the initiative that you heard from, called Finance for Biodiversity, they are a significant resource for contributing. They have regular meetings where they share, we're doing this, we found this provider, because that's one of the challenges as well. Where do you find the data, right? So they really share information that enables them to collaboratively advance, and then they share that information publicly to support other institutions in terms of best practices, in terms of finding the data that they need. Engaging with companies is absolutely required, not only for companies improving, which is what we need them to do if we want to reduce our exposure to that risk, but also even start disclosing. So many of these organizations are not yet disclosing. It's very different from climate, which, especially in developed markets, most of these markets now do require mandatorily that large listed companies disclose, and increasingly SMEs as well, as we've seen, for example, trickle down in the UK. Assessing the impact, right? How do you find the information? How do you identify ways to engage with companies so that you can assess the impact that they have, and thus that you have via your capital allocation? Setting targets and reporting publicly. So this is quite a challenging and ambitious commitment that they have made. Where can you start? Perhaps this over here would be, my 2 cents. UNEPify, which is the financial initiative of UNEP, the environmental program of the UN, has set a guidance for banks, typically larger banks, but certainly applicable to co-op banks such as yourself, on how do you start looking at biodiversity? How do you set targets? So this could be a good place to start. Just some case studies. I know it might not be relevant to most of you, but perhaps to some of your groups at a group level, you might have some asset managers, etc. But I thought it was interesting just to share a little bit of what is already being done, right? So on the left, I mentioned, full disclosure, I worked with OCM to develop this fund, which reduced the mean species abundance, the MSA, by 80%, specifically in the food industry, but foods considering kind of the large definition of foods. On the right, you have an index fund, Solactive, which together with a rating agency created an index that invests, or does invest, but right, if you have an ETF, but anyway, has companies with high impact, high positive impact on biodiversity. On the bottom, you have Pictet, which selected a different indicator. So they didn't select the MSA, they selected the rate of extinction. And here you see on the right, the reduction of the rate of extinction that their portfolio has in comparison to their benchmark. So what does it mean in theory to integrate these? It could be, for example, having a definition in your co-op bank of how do we rank this? What is a leader in biodiversity in certain sectors, especially those that are most exposed to it, in terms of how well they mitigate their risk of biodiversity loss and that impacting the business. If you think of biodiversity, you absolutely need to think of agriculture, for example. You think of mining, you think of, and at times it's a bit not evident, right? It's a little less clear than climate, but there are already good studies showing what are the highest sectors and countries at risk from biodiversity. So there can be a framework that you start developing internally to assess the exposure of your clients or potential clients to biodiversity. On the other hand, let's not only think about the financial risk to your loan book, but also think about the impact, right? Because we want to transition the capital so that, remember when we were starting the conversation about it's not just idiosyncratic risk to your portfolio, but if the financial market is impacted, if GDP is not growing as fast as it could because of, as robustly as it could, because of biodiversity, you're going to suffer as well together with the market, right? So let's think at how we can start to assess as well, not only the risk, but also the impact that your clients or your existing loan portfolio has on biodiversity. Sometimes these overlap. The companies that are managing best their biodiversity have a positive contribution. And sometimes they don't overlap at all, right? And perhaps I'll do a little tangent here. When people in the industry criticize that rating agencies, ESG rating agencies, don't have correlation, I think at times they're a bit they're a bit blind to why that is, right? And why it actually makes sense. Because some ESG ratings, they look at financial risk. Other ESG ratings, they look at impact, and not necessarily the company that has negative impact is highly exposed to the risk, right? It can be different. So very different frameworks, and something for us to consider the importance of the two of them. And one of the things that you can consider if you're looking to roll this out is already having like a predefined range, right? So for example, this over here, mostly with regards to climate, but just to give you an idea, if you think, for example, of airlines, it's basically you're not having a very positive contribution. You're basically having a quite negative contribution. But if you think of renewable energy, why do you have that high range? It's because you can be doing fantastic on contributing to emission reduction, right? But on the other hand, if you're not produced in a way that is responsibly in terms of human rights, in terms of labor rights, you could actually be considered not sustainable, right? So by having a cheat sheet in your internal framework, you can actually support your account managers, your financial analysts to understand where already a company fits within this range of either be at risk or impact in this case. And then finally, the most advanced financial institutions are already considering specifically in their discounted cash flow models, right? So how can you integrate, for example, anticipated increase in CapEx that might be needed for a company to mitigate its risk, perhaps the opportunity that a company has to sell a solution, right, for biodiversity loss. And so all of that can be integrated into financial models. So I'll end the presentation here. I think that was quite a bit for you to digest, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of where the regulators are already thinking quite advancedly about this. France have already acted in requiring financial institutions to report on biodiversity risk and impact. And then what are some of the key initiatives that the industries are doing, resources for you, and some initial thoughts on how an internal framework could look like if you're interested in taking this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarisse. We might all have know what biodiversity is. However, we have an understanding of it, right? And thank you very much for the explanation of with the different biodiversities. However, I now really personally understood how not only how important it is, but how it has been now raised up, as you said. We were talking about climate change, how this is important, but what is the impact of climate change on biodiversity, and what are the consequences? And then there is an emergency on that too. And in a philosophical point of view, if the biodiversity dies, we die along, right? In the Indian culture, they say that with something that the Indians don't understand, especially in Brazil and Amazonia, is that they say we don't understand how you don't see that, how the biodiversity is important because we are part of it and we have to take care of it. So personally, also again, thank you very much. It raised also, it's very not reassuring, but it has, with your presentation today, personally, I also think, where are we at? What are we doing? Not only as, how are we reflecting? How are we taking care of ourselves? And it's a good question that you have asked to all of us today, working within cooperative banks. What are we concretely doing to take care of ourselves, not only of our customers, of our finances, etc., but also to preserve the biodiversity. So a big thank you to your presentation. It has raised the awareness, I hope, for all of you, and it has put some good interrogations and questions. I see some of the colleagues thinking. I see some faces, some familiar faces, like Rogerio, for instance, thinking. Hello. So please, I would leave the word also to all of you, or some of you, if you want to share what is happening in your organization, if among our European colleagues, among our Latin American colleagues. What would be your reflections about what Clarisse shared with us today? Are you aware of what your company is doing, or are you volunteering in some associations, or preoccupied with this access? Well, I think that we'll be curious to hear from you, or receive also your questions to Clarisse.
Did I start? Monika Bäumel from Volksbank in Vienna. To be honest, we only care about climate at the moment. So it was really very interesting to get an insight, and also the presentation, because I can use it to somehow, make this theme also popular and then take first steps. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monika.
If I have more.
I'm sorry. Me too.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jules.
It's just to see if I understood. Hi, Clarisse. We have always looked at climate when we talk about ESG. So now I'm understanding it's like they're adding the biodiversity into ESG. And now we're going to look more into this pillar, I'd say. I don't know if we could call it a pillar. For us, as Monika said, it's very new. And it's quite scary when you see people from other companies saying that their deadline is 2024. I can't say we're not doing anything here, but biodiversity is very new. When we first talked, you even mentioned, and I was like, what do we include when you talk about biodiversity? So for us as cooperative banks, how do you see in a practical term, what could we be doing? Like you said, institutions have to report on biodiversity. Is it so different to what we already do for climate? How different is it from the climate report that we already are working on? I don't know if that's a basic question. It's because it doesn't seem so obvious for us because it's such a new topic.
And I don't think it's obvious to anyone. I think the reality that we have to recognize, and apologies, I'm referring to her as you because we know each other personally, just so that others don't think that I'm that intimate with strangers. So I think one of the things that is incredibly important is having the being humble about where we are as an industry and where each organization is in this journey. And there's no problem in being at the start, right? I think it's by recognizing that we don't know what to do, that we can actually advance and do something. I think most organizations don't know. And that's why Finance for Biodiversity exists, right? They say we need to share information because each of us knows very little. So if we want to advance at the minimum speed necessary, we need to collaborate and share information. So what's different about biodiversity? There are many aspects that are similar to climate, right? In terms of how do you engage with a company, et cetera, et cetera. What is different is it's a lot more complex than climate, right? Because when you speak to an SME, they've heard about climates everywhere. You can explain to someone carbon emissions. How do you start explaining to someone about biodiversity, right? So it's almost like you have to inform yourself a lot better than you had to inform yourself about climate because it is a lot more complex. There's no carbon equivalent, right? How do you explain to someone, what's your mean species abundance impact? Right? I mean, it seems like we're light years away from that. But we can ask someone, what are your carbon emissions? And they'll probably say, let me check with a sustainability expert, I'll get back to you, right? But so I think that's going to be the trickiness of it. It's that individuals, kind of classic individuals from the finance world, will have to be minimally informed in something that's a lot more complex than climate, to have a dialogue with the companies to start saying, look, you're in the agricultural industry. I want to start understanding how exposed you are to biodiversity risk, right? How do you start collecting information on that? Yeah.
It changes
so
from
it'll
place
start
to
with
place, right? Yes,
a lot. Yeah. So I think education is the place to start, right? And then recognizing, we do think that very quickly there will be one indicator that is more used than others. So hopefully that will be a relief for us, that we'll all start converging on, be it extinction, be it MSA, etc. So that at least we'll have a shared understanding of what is this indicator, but starting to look at hotspots, starting to look at, deforestation. Deforestation is something that people understand a lot better because of climate, right? But yeah, it's going to be a journey. But I think perhaps going back to your question and linking to Monica's, building on your point, Monica, start engaging with your colleagues, right? Get this presentation and share with 5-10 people that you know, and say, look, are you aware that France has already started requesting this, and as part of the EU, we anticipate that this might be picked up quite quickly. TNFD, it's coming up. The TCFD started as a recommendation, and now we're seeing it become mandatory very, very quickly.
Yeah, maybe it's something we could discuss here in the CIBP girls, see what each bank is doing, because for us it's very new. So, but thank you, Clarisse.
My pleasure.
So Clarisse, I also have a question. You mentioned, for example, France with the Article 29, I think, that they're already actively working on it. So where do you, as the expert, see this global topic in the next 10 years? Where do you see the future of this? Where's the tendency? What's the development? Where do you see the world, the universe in 10 years, let's say, or in 5 years from now? I know it's difficult. I'm sorry if it's too general, but I know it's difficult.
Let me get my crystal ball. Hold on. I don't know, and I would certainly not try to indicate that I have any idea of where we're going. But I think the message here has been, and I think I can only reemphasize it, biodiversity will become a minimum standard for financial products, for risk assessment. It will be integrated in risk frameworks across banks. We will have stress tests against it. So now the stress tests that include interest rates, inflation, et cetera, will include climate, will include biodiversity. So I think, yeah, that's the direction that I see us going.
Thank you.
I would suggest to jump in Brigitte's question and Juliana's suggestion that also triggers, as I said, and thank you, Monica, for sharing. There is an emergency, and I think it personally touches me in something concrete. As we are talking a lot of climate change, and we see the devastation of it, but we have not thought of the little ones, let's say, if I may, or the ones who have no voice, if I can say it like this. So I'm really very happy personally of what I've learned today. And so jumping on Monica, Juliana, Brigitte, and all of you, please don't hesitate to send us an email or to send an email to Clarisse with your thoughts, because I think that it has started something for us in any case, or continue on something that you have been working on. To invite you again, Clarisse, because we don't have the crystal ball for in 10 years, but it will be interesting to see, with this target for 2024, how and as you have said with education, how we're spreading the word and in the world, and how it has maybe accelerated. You are sharing with us today, we'll be sharing with others tomorrow, and who knows, maybe it will expand and it will be exponential, and there is something that can be done and raise awareness on that. So for that, I really thank you, and I'm looking forward to invite you. Let's discuss for next session next year. To the attention of all our SPARK attendees today, as you may know, we want to offer this SPARK platform to all our members. So once a month, one of our members suggests a topic to be shared with all of you on a topic that they seem of interest and that would be interested to share on. And sometimes we invite experts, external people like you, Clarisse, who bring us to another thought. So let's make an appointment for 2023. If there are no questions, I suggest we close this session today. Again, thank you very much for attending. Again, this platform is here for you. Use it, communicate, exchange, connect, ask questions, answer questions, etc., etc. It's a try. We try always, and I hope it brings you something. Thank you again. Thank you very much, Clarisse.
Thank you so much for the invitation, for your thoughtful questions, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for this valuable platform. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.